Okay, so was heißt Glaube? What is faith will be the axis around which this reflection on the mirror between Strauss's introduction to his Spinoza book and our Dostoevsky text in chapter 7 of the Devils. But we'll be focusing on the side of Strauss in this report on my current investigation into this text, which is at the same time an investigation into, in this case, into the essence of Leo Strauss's teaching in an attempt to discern that essence, and which is at the same time, in a larger sense, a question about how to find guidance for human beings' simpliciter. So let me read something from that introduction, which I'll title Jenseits von Gut und Böse, Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche's title. Somewhat more literally, well, not literally, but if you break the words apart, that side of good and evil. So Strauss speaks, when Strauss teaches this text, Nietzsche's text, he gives the example of the transalpine. So this simply means, from the perspective of the Romans, you're transalpine when you go beyond the Alps. Beyond the Alps are maybe at one point Hannibal's terrible elephants. But let's look at the text here. Spinoza rejects both Greek idealism and Christian spiritualism. The biblical God forms light and rejects darkness, makes peace and creates evil. Spinoza's God is simply beyond good and evil. So good and evil are relative to human concerns, but there's a step beyond them to when we come to this proper contemplation of the source out of which all the sweetness sweetness of being and the endless darkness of being. So Greek idealism, what does that mean? Strauss himself often strikes this phrase from usage, but he uses it himself here. He has difficulty with that throughout his work, just as he has difficulty with the word fact throughout his work, because it's so in vogue. And referring to the Greeks as idealist is also very powerful. And we speak here also of Christian spiritualism. Spiritus in the medieval usage means the same thing as intellectus, and the theologians distinguished faith from spiritus or intellect. So this is a problem we're approaching and we're trying to get to here. What is the problem with faith, and what is faith more clearly? So from the philosophic side, we want to be able to say what faith is in a simple way so we can understand it. However, from, let's say, the side of religious orthodoxy, where orthodoxy is already a difficult phrase because it's not necessary until it comes into a certain light where you can make a distinction between orthodoxy and modernity, in this case with respect to Judaism, but has a wider importance. Let's look at a second citation to get our bearings and our starting point. This is from the very end of the Strauss's introduction, where he's making what seems to be a conclusion. The atheism from intellectual probity, which overcomes orthodoxy radically by understanding it radically, i.e., without the polemical bitterness of enlightenment and the equivocal reverence of romanticism. So the polemical bitterness of enlightenment, I think the highest work I know of that makes that very accessible is this polemic between the characters of George Berkeley, who are polemicizing with the quote-unquote free thinkers or the minute philosophers in Berkeley's Alciphron. And this means people such as the author of the Fable of the Bees, this idea of the modern settlement with respect to private vices and public benefits, or as Bill Clinton popularized it with doing well, no, that's not quite the same thing. I think of the modern version of it as doing good through doing well. It's almost the same thing, but it's concealed. Doing well means doing well for yourself. So in a way, that's just a nice way of saying being greedy. But supposedly greed is good, as we know from the cheap movie slogan, because it gets commerce flowing. It supposedly creates jobs, it creates liquidity, which allows small businesses to open, and all the standard selling points still go in our time that went in the time that the commercial thinking became popular. On the other side, the romanticism we could link fairly easily to the Dritte Reich or Third Reich. The Third Reich was initially called Tausend Jahriges Reich. I think that was dropped around 1939 and replaced with the talk of maybe nothing replaced it, but the rationale for 1,000-year Reich is that from 800 to 1800, the Holy Roman Empire, which originally was a Christian empire, but by Voltaire's time, the famous denouncement that it was neither Holy Roman or an empire had become true. But Voltaire was writing at the end of that empire. This empire did not have. So, in other words, why I went into that is to say that Rome, which Dostoevsky's text and characters are presenting as the origin of the god of the state, is not directly pointed to in the phrase Third Reich, but nonetheless, the swastika, which was all over Roman buildings and a symbol of the Romans and the Roman state, and which you'll find today in neoclassical buildings around universities, especially built before World War II, points directly to Rome. And of course, Romanticism is just another way of saying Romanism, at least so far as the meaning of the direct meaning of the word goes. So Strauss is saying here there's something between those two directions. They should point to somebody like Richard Dawkins, maybe Steven Pinker. Dawkins is a better example of that mentality. Now, a more difficult case would be Chomsky and people, MIT type of people, engineering mentality type of people. I can't treat with that just yet. I want to get into that in a coming video. But here, what I want to bring out is Strauss's apparent thesis. So Strauss is saying that Spinoza has to take the role of somebody who with loyal and loving reshaping reshapes Judaism. So Strauss's contention is that tradition can't be dry rehearsal of something written down a long time ago. It has to be alive. So the claim he's making is Spinoza has reshaped Judaism because he's a living representative of it, or at least Strauss is presenting this as a reading. And it seems to me that Strauss is throwing his lot in with Spinoza. So the crux of the issue is this. At a certain moment, what we're now calling retrospectively orthodoxy, in the light of the possibility of distinguishing between the Orthodox and the modern or secular Jew. There was no possibility of that, then there became a possibility of it. There becomes a question of, in Judaism itself, of faith and reason, which didn't exist before. So we hear this question of faith and reason with respect to quote unquote religion as a generic all the time now. This will link us up also to Dostoevsky's talk of the half-truth of science, which, especially if you listen just to this micro recording, which nonetheless has a very resistless power to it, because Heidegger is very careful in his enunciation and in what he puts forward. He's thought it through for a long time before he says anything. In the small account between the Buddhist monk and Heidegger, Heidegger gives his account of why, in a nutshell, he gives his account of why modern science shows that we're all verrückt in the same sense that any religious faith shows that we're verrückt. Which is to say, we go out beyond what we know in the simple sense in religion. This question of that religion is not to be taken simply for granted, that faith is not to be taken simply for granted. Strauss is saying he implies Spinoza was one of the first to, in any profound way, become aware of this problem. So once you have to ask that question, you're in a different situation. And then the question is, we have today the phrase intellectual rigor, which is characteristic of our own time. It sounds like technical supremacy of some kind. But Strauss uses the phrase intellectual probity. Probity, I would gloss as follows: what we take to be self-evident in our most sure feeling that we're right. So, what we take to be self-evident when we consciously consider a matter, which is a weighty matter, what seems to be self-evidently true to us, we have to stick to that. That's intellectual probity. It doesn't mean what it means often in the current discussion, which I think is somehow in a cheap way derivative of Sartre, which and it also has to do with debate culture, where people are accused of lack of intellectual good faith. That's a question of whether one is with the other arguing fairly and honestly. Intellectual probity doesn't mean that. It means with ourselves in our direct apprehension of an issue. Are we, does it seem self-evident to us? And can we simply lie to ourselves and stick with something else? So the first question is, does the question now have to be posed? Whereas it wasn't posed in any serious way in Maimonides' time. Remember, Guide to the Perplexed, which is so popular today because it has a philosophic ring to it, because it's Aristotelian, because it's almost like Catholic doctrine, because it's theological in the sense that theology is the suffix ology signals science in the Greek sense, philosophical sense, was for Maimonides the guide for the people that don't get it, the non-believers. The real book for him was his prescriptions of how to live, the Mishnah Torah. So Strauss is saying, in the light of this problem coming to have a bearing on intellectual probity, Spinoza has, as the living representative of Judaism, tried to open up this new avenue as Judaism. So I think I have very little time on this recording because the phone has very little memory. But in the next time, we're going to look at what is faith or Glaube. How is that distinguished from opinion? How is it distinguished from knowledge, scientia or scientia? And what is the position of this Spinozan reason, which points to Deuteronomy 4:6, I believe it is, about reason, about understanding in the tradition of the Torah? Where do we stand so far as perhaps when we're thinking of this in the light of the 7th chapter of Dostoevsky's Possessed, where we see there's these different gods? Where do we stand with respect to those gods? Where do we stand with respect to the god of, which is being assigned to the Greeks, philosophy, and this other, the god of the state, the god of, and the third god, this god of Judaism, and so forth? Where is